The cold sliced into his skin like 1,000 sharp blades. Wind howled through the thick curtain of snow, whipping flurries into the air as if trying to swallow everything in its path. Lucas Bennett could no longer feel his fingers. They'd gone numb long ago as he dug frantically through the heavy snow, trying to pull the motionless creature from its frozen grave. Beneath the icy layer, a pair of cloudy eyes fluttered open, then quickly shut again. It was a wolf, large and majestic, even in its depleted state. Its jet-black fur was crusted with ice, and its breath was so faint that Lucas almost missed it entirely. Gritting his teeth, he summoned the last of his strength to drag the wolf's heavy body from the snow pit. The wind whipped his face, cold enough to slice through bone. But Lucas didn't stop. He tore off his scarf, wrapped it around the animal's body, and gently placed a hand on its head. The wolf didn't react. Only a faint sound of breath broke the silence. Lucas knew it was teetering on the thin line between life and death. If he didn't act now, the creature wouldn't make it through the night. Without hesitation, he bent down, slipped both arms beneath the wolf, and tried to lift it. It was heavier than he'd expected, its body stiff from the cold. He stumbled, but held on tight, trudging slowly through the deep snow toward the small abandoned shed near his home. The shed had once belonged to his grandfather, Samuel, used for storing tools, but it had long since fallen out of use. It was the perfect place to hide Fang without his grandfather finding out. After nearly 10 minutes of wrestling with the wind and snow, Lucas finally reached the door. He shoved it open, rusty hinges groaning into the quiet night. He laid the wolf down on the cold wooden floor, then quickly gathered the leftover straw, forming a rough cushion beneath it. Shedding his coat, he carefully draped it over the wolf's body. Lucas knelt beside him, examining more closely. It was a full-grown male, his body marked with faint scars, signs of countless battles for survival. But the most striking was a long gash running down one shoulder, painful and proud all at once. He paused, thinking. A name worthy of one who had braved the blizzard and carried the scars of the past. Fang. Lucas sat quietly beside Fang for a long while. He knew he couldn't stay much longer. His grandfather, Samuel, could wake up at any moment. But he also couldn't walk away without some certainty that the wolf would be okay. He pulled off his gloves, rubbed his palms together for warmth, then gently pressed them against the fur near Fang's wound. Suddenly Fang stirred. Lucas could feel it. His heart was still beating, faint but steady. Carefully Lucas stood, pulled his coat back into place, and stepped out of the shed. Before closing the old wooden door, he turned for one last look. In the pale moonlight, Fang remained still, but his breathing was more even now. The morning light crept through snow-laden branches, casting a dim glow over the frozen ground outside the porch. Wolf tracks were stamped into the white snow around Samuel and Lucas's home. They stretched from the deep woods to the edge of the front steps, a faint but unmistakable trail. The wolves were no longer lurking in the shadows. They were getting closer. Samuel stood still, eyes scanning the tracks carved into the snow. His weathered fingers gripped the stock of his old hunting rifle, a reflex born of years spent in the wild. A long breath escaped him, dissolving into the biting air of a winter morning. Lucas stepped onto the porch, not needing to look to know what his grandfather was thinking. He could feel it, the tension growing inside Samuel. Over the past week, the tracks hadn't just appeared here and there. They'd become more frequent, clearer, and the most terrifying part of it all was that it was his fault. The pack had come closer than they ever should have, and the people of Hollow Creek had surely noticed. The air in town had grown heavier. What started as quiet murmurs had turned into tense conversations. People weren't whispering about wolves anymore. They were openly afraid. In the corner of the small cafe on Main Street, men spoke in low voices about how to protect their livestock. At the grocery store, the shopkeeper nodded solemnly as an elderly woman described the howling that kept her awake the night before. Fear was spreading like wildfire through dry grass. A town meeting was called at the hall. Tense faces, nods of agreement, eyes filled with doubt and worry. Someone stood up and insisted they needed to protect their families. Someone else countered. There was no solid proof the wolves had attacked anyone. Voices rose, then fell into scattered comments. No decision was made, but everyone understood one thing clearly. If the wolves kept coming closer to town, a hunt was only a matter of time. Lucas sat quietly outside the town hall as the meeting wrapped up. Samuel stepped slowly through the doors, his deep-set eyes steady and resolute. Lucas didn't have to ask. He already knew his grandfather had supported the plan. Dinner that night passed in silence. A dull yellow light shone down over the wooden table, where Samuel quietly ate his soup without a word. Lucas set his spoon down, watching him closely, and finally tried to speak. "You're okay with a wolf hunt?" His voice was low, but still cut through the stillness of the small kitchen. Samuel didn't look at him, continuing to lift his spoon with slow, deliberate motions. But when he set the bowl down, he sighed, his eyes finally meeting Lucas's. "You know this is necessary," he said. "No, I don't," Lucas shot back. "You and everyone else are just afraid of them, but they haven't hurt anyone." The rest of dinner passed under a heavy silence. Lucas knew the wolf tracks around their home weren't random. Fang had come back, not to attack, but to repay a debt. Ever since the night Lucas pulled him from the snow, the black wolf hadn't forgotten. He didn't nuzzle Lucas's legs or wag his tail like a pet dog would, but he showed his gratitude in the instinctual way only a predator could. Every morning, small animals were left on the porch. At first, Lucas thought it was coincidence, but each time he opened the door, he'd spot those silent golden eyes in the distance, watching from behind snow-covered trees. Fang hadn't just survived. He'd accepted Lucas as part of his pack, but that loyalty had pushed everything dangerously close to the edge. Lucas knew the wolves weren't the enemy. They hadn't hurt anyone. But to Samuel, it was never that simple. The past had carved its mark on him like a scar that never healed. Years ago, in a winter just as brutal as this one, Samuel had watched his best friend fall. A routine hunt turned into a nightmare when they stumbled upon a furious grizzly. In the blinding snowstorm, Samuel had tried. He'd screamed, he'd run, but it wasn't fast enough. It ended in a flash. Snarling, blood-streaked snow, ragged breaths, and a friend who never came back. Since then, he had never looked at the forest the same. To him, it wasn't a place of freedom or mystery, but one that could take everything if you let your guard down. Wolves, bears, any wild creature were all the same to him. They couldn't be trusted. Since that tense dinner, Lucas had been spending more time in the forest. He couldn't convince Samuel that the wolves weren't a threat, and he couldn't stop him from joining the hunt. But if he couldn't change his grandfather's mind, he could still protect Fang in his own way. Every time Lucas entered the forest, Fang would appear, silent, ever watchful, following his steps like a guardian spirit. No commands, no leash. The wolf simply knew. Lucas didn't belong out there alone, and it was his job to protect him from the dangers he hadn't yet imagined. And he was right. Something was wrong in the forest. Cold wind whispered through nearly bare trees, carrying soft snowflakes to the forest floor. Lucas walked slowly, eyes sharp and alert. This was the area Samuel had always warned him to stay away from. Deep in the whispering pines, a stretch of old-growth forest that had been strictly off-limits for generations. But the signs Lucas was seeing told a different story. Tree stumps lay scattered across the clearing, rough cuts exposing fresh, pale wood. Some trunks still bore the marks of chainsaws, proof they'd been felled recently. Lucas knelt down, fingers brushing over the raw edge of a stump, tracing the sharp grain. His hand clenched. This wasn't legal work. Someone was quietly logging in the protected forest. Fang stood beside him, ears perked, breath rising in white plumes into the frigid air. The wolf moved slowly, nose low to the ground, then stopped, its golden eyes flickering with alertness. Lucas was just about to follow when a sound echoed through the trees. He ducked behind a thick trunk, holding his breath. A low, gruff voice carried through the silence. "We need to finish before the weekend. This load's going to bring in serious money." Lucas squinted, peering through the tangled branches. Down the slope, a group of men stood beside a fresh pile of felled trees. He recognized two of them immediately: Victor Hale, the wealthiest businessman in town, and Sheriff Tom Brooks. "But what if someone finds out?" Tom lowered his voice, clearly uneasy. Victor let out a short, cold laugh that echoed through the trees. "This town is small, Tom. Who's going to find out? The Rangers? We've taken care of that. They only inspect the permitted zones. This forest—" He swept his gaze across the cleared area, voice indifferent. "No one's watching." Lucas felt his heartbeat pounding in his chest. This wasn't just illegal logging. It was a carefully planned operation, with cover from within the authorities. If it continued, the entire forest would be gone, along with the habitat of hundreds of animals, including Fang and his pack. Startled, Lucas accidentally stepped on a dry branch. The soft crack was barely audible, but enough to raise suspicion. Tom spun around. "Someone there?" Lucas held his breath, pressing himself tightly against the tree trunk. Victor narrowed his eyes and motioned to Tom. "Careful, go check it out." Lucas could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. If they found him, he wasn't sure he could escape. But just as the footsteps drew nearer, Fang let out a low, chilling growl. A sharp, rumbling sound cut through the woods. The men froze. "It's a wolf," one of them whispered. Victor scowled, but his expression quickly relaxed. "These damn beasts are getting bolder." He turned to Tom. "One more reason to clear this place out. If anyone finds tracks, we'll just blame the wolves." Lucas didn't wait another second. He slipped backward, using their distraction to make a quiet escape. Fang followed close behind, silent as a shadow. He didn't stop until the warm glow of Samuel's cabin flickered between the trees. When he stepped inside, his grandfather was seated by the fireplace, flipping through a newspaper. At the sight of Lucas, his brow furrowed. "Where were you?" Lucas took a breath, trying to steady himself. "In the woods, I found something." He quickly recounted what he'd seen and heard. But when he finished, Samuel just stared at him, his gaze sharper than ever. "You're imagining things," he said. Lucas froze. "I'm not. I heard them." If something like that were really happening, someone would have found out by now. Samuel set the paper down and sighed. "That old-growth forest has been protected for decades. No one can just go in and start cutting." Lucas clenched his jaw. "But they did! They're cutting trees right inside the restricted area, don't you see? If it doesn't stop, the wolves, everything." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the change in Samuel's expression. For a brief second, something shifted. His hand on the armrest tightened until the knuckles turned white. A strange tension flickered in his eyes, then vanished, replaced by his usual calm. "That's enough, Lucas." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an unshakable finality. Lucas looked at his grandfather, the man who had taught him how to read trails, how to survive in the wild, but who now refused to believe him. He couldn't tell Samuel he'd seen the stumps himself, because that would mean admitting he'd gone into the forbidden zone. And Samuel didn't believe him. Something inside Lucas felt like it cracked. If he wanted to protect the forest, he would have to do it on his own. Just when Lucas was at a loss for what to do next, he realized someone was already standing at the door. A tall, lean figure in a thick gray coat, tousled brown hair catching the faint light. Lucas froze. Caleb Hale, the son of Victor Hale, the man leading the illegal logging. Caleb's eyes were sharp, unreadable, but not threatening. "I heard you're trying to stop the wolf hunt," he said. Lucas blinked, the tension rising in his chest. But before he could say anything, Caleb continued, voice low and steady. "So am I." Lucas opened the door and gestured for him to come in. Samuel wasn't home. Only the warm kitchen and the soft crackle of fire in the hearth remained. Caleb stepped inside, but didn't sit right away. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the small, cozy space. He seemed hesitant, like he was still deciding whether to speak the whole truth. Lucas pulled out a chair and sat down, watching Caleb with a mix of curiosity and caution. This was Victor Hale's son, the last person he expected to see here. But the boy standing before him looked worn, eyes heavy with something more than secrets. "What do you want?" Lucas asked, his voice low. Caleb sat in silence for a moment, his eyes fixed on the flickering fire. Then he let out a long breath, as if it had been held in for years. "I want to stop my father. He's been tearing this forest apart for years. Sooner or later, the whole ecosystem will collapse." Lucas froze. He hadn't expected Caleb to come here and speak so directly, so openly, against his own father. Caleb kept staring into the fire, but his mind was clearly somewhere else. He was remembering a time when he used to be proud of his father, a powerful man, respected by everyone in Hollow Creek. Victor Hale was always dressed in tailored suits, shaking hands with the most important people, speaking with authority in a way that made others stop and listen. Caleb had once believed his father was someone who would protect Hollow Creek. He talked about developing the town, creating jobs, bringing prosperity to the region. And as a child, Caleb believed every word. He thought logging was just part of progress, that it didn't really harm anything the way the critics claimed. But then he began noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. Forests vanishing. Once clear streams turned to cloudy, muddied trickles. Fewer animals in the woods. And when he asked about it, his father would just laugh and say nature would adapt. That it always did. But it didn't. He saw starving deer grazing along the edge of town. He saw owls flying alone through the night sky because their trees had been destroyed. Caleb tried to convince himself it wasn't that bad, that his father had reasons. But as he got older, he saw the documents in his father's office. Contracts signed in secret, money passed under the table to silence opposition. And he knew he couldn't lie to himself anymore. His father wasn't protecting the town. He was destroying it, piece by piece. But the worst part wasn't the environmental damage. It was how little Victor seemed to care about anything beyond his own gain. He didn't care what he ruined. He didn't care about the animals that lost their homes. He didn't care about the people, even his own son, who were starting to turn against him. Caleb remembered the first time he confronted his father. He'd asked why the logging continued even though they had made more than enough money, why the predators had to be hunted down to expand further. His father had just laughed, a hollow, soulless laugh Caleb had never heard before. "Because that's how the world works," he'd said. "The strong take. The forest doesn't belong to nature. It belongs to whoever can harvest it." That was the moment Caleb realized this man was no longer someone he could admire. The disappointment hadn't come all at once. It was slow, steady, and irreversible. Every forest cleared. Every species that vanished from the land. Every time his father stepped out of his office, smiling after sealing another deal, it all chipped away at Caleb's belief in him. He had tried to pull away, tried not to get dragged into the path his father had chosen. But some things couldn't be ignored. And now, with the wolves in the crosshairs, some of the last wild creatures still roaming freely, Caleb knew he had to act. He had already let his father destroy too much. This time, he wouldn't let it happen. Lucas looked at Caleb and saw not just disappointment, but frustration and anger boiling beneath the surface. "So what do you want?" he asked. Caleb leaned forward, his voice steady, low. "I know you care about this forest. I know you've been trying to do something, and I need an ally." He lowered his voice even more. "I can't stop my father on my own." Lucas clenched his fists. He had always thought he was alone in this fight. But now he wasn't. There was a place he had heard about, a place deep in the forest where the old trees had vanished, a place people only spoke of in vague terms. He had seen tire tracks pressed deep into the hardened ground. He had heard strange noises echoing from that direction when he'd ventured into the woods with Fang. But he'd never dared go near. Now, he would have to. Outside, the distant howls echoed through the air, long and low, like a wordless warning. The wolves were appearing more often now, not just lurking in the shadows, but standing at the edge of the forest, their glowing yellow eyes watching from the dark. Hollow Creek had never been a place that welcomed wolves. People had always seen them as dangerous predators, monsters that could strike at any moment. But now, with their presence growing, so did the town's fear. Conversations at the cafe were no longer idle talk. They had turned into serious discussions about how to deal with the wolves. No one asked why the pack had come so close. No one wondered if they might be fleeing something worse. All they saw was a threat. The wolves were there, and that was enough. Lucas clenched his fists, locking eyes with Caleb. He knew the wolves weren't just hunters. They weren't here to threaten the town. They were warning it. But Hollow Creek would never understand that. And if they didn't act soon, the wolf hunt would only be the beginning, before the entire forest was destroyed. Since joining forces, Caleb and Lucas had begun to share more with each other. One day, Caleb led Lucas down a narrow path winding through tall pines blanketed in thick white snow. The cold wind tugged at their coats, making each step heavier. After a long, silent walk through a dimming forest, an old wooden cabin slowly came into view. It stood deep in the woods, hidden in the shade of towering oak trees, as if trying to bury all the secrets of the wildlife its former occupant once lived. Lucas stepped inside with a mix of curiosity and unease. The air was damp and cold, but faintly touched by a lingering scent. Something gentle, like the memory of a woman who had once deeply loved the natural world. On a dust-covered table, a journal wrapped in pale green leather caught Lucas's eye immediately. Caleb gave a subtle nod, urging him to open it. The pages inside had yellowed with time, but the handwriting, elegant and soft, remained clear, as if it had just been written yesterday. Lucas carefully turned each page, his eyes scanning line after line filled with a deep, tender love for nature. Through these entries, he began to understand a woman who had been brave, strong, and yet carried a quiet gentleness that was hard to describe. The journal spoke of her encounters with the wolves, how she cared for them, even spoke to them, especially Fang, the black alpha with eyes that sparkled like stars. Her notes didn't just describe a bond. They revealed the wolf's intelligence, loyalty, and a fierce instinct to protect. But the further they read, the more the entries began to shift. The handwriting grew shaky, as if written through tears. A darker truth emerged in the pages where she wrote of her husband, Victor Hale. She hadn't hesitated to document what Victor had done, the efforts to cover up illegal destruction of the forest, the accidents he'd engineered to scare her off her mission. Her heartbreak poured into the pages as she realized the man she had once loved was being consumed by greed, losing his humanity and becoming the very threat to the forest she fought so hard to protect. Lucas sat still, stunned, eyes wide as the truth about Caleb's father came into focus. He turned to Caleb, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Caleb's voice trembled. "Since Mom died, I've felt so alone. My dad changed completely. He's not the man I once looked up to. All he sees now is money, and I can't stop him. She used to say that love for nature was what connected people, but I don't know if I can ever bring him back." They were both still reeling from the emotion when a soft noise came from the door. Caleb jumped, heart pounding. In the dim light of the oil lamp, a pair of glowing eyes appeared from the darkness. Fang. His gaze reflected the soft glow, steady and clear. Caleb took a step back, startled by the sudden appearance of the large wolf, but Fang moved slowly, confidently toward him. His eyes held no threat, only calm. Lucas stood still, watching closely, and saw no hint of danger in Fang's posture. Instead, he sensed something else, something warm, steady. A quiet calm that radiated from the wolf, as if Fang understood all the sorrow and loneliness Caleb carried. Caleb met the wolf's gaze, and little by little, the fear inside him dissolved. Without thinking, he reached out, hesitated for a breath, then gently touched the thick, warm fur on Fang's neck. In that moment, Caleb saw the shadow of his mother, the woman who had devoted her life to protecting Fang and his pack from the very man who now threatened them. In Fang's eyes, Caleb realized this wolf held no hatred for humans. On the contrary, he had always tried to shield the vulnerable from the endless greed of mankind. Tears slid down Caleb's face as he whispered an apology. To Fang, and to the forest his mother had once loved so fiercely. Fang lowered his head slightly, as if to accept the apology, then sat beside him in silence, allowing the boy to wrap his arms around his neck with quiet gratitude. Lucas stood back, heart stirring at the sight. He knew that this moment had formed something powerful between them, a bond deeper than words, a quiet confirmation of what Caleb's mother had written in her journal. Love for nature is the invisible thread that ties our hearts together, helping us endure every sorrow and loss. Outside the cabin, the winter wind still swept through the whispering pines, but inside, 3 young lives, 2 boys and a wolf, had found something rare, a shared understanding that reached beyond fear, beyond prejudice, and warmed them with something real. After leaving the snow-covered cabin deep in the woods, Lucas carried the old journal with him. The pages, yellowed with time, weighed heavily in his hands, just as the burden on his heart grew heavier with the responsibility he now felt. He had to convince his grandfather. He had to make Samuel see that the wolves, especially Fang, were not a threat. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. That evening, as he returned to the cabin near the forest's edge, he found his grandfather sitting silently by the fireplace. The old man's gaze was fixed on the flames, but his eyes seemed lost somewhere far away, buried deep in memory. Lucas stepped in quietly, holding the journal, and spoke in a soft voice that barely disturbed the silence between them. "Grandpa, I found this at Caleb's mother's old cabin. I think you should read it." Samuel turned to him, surprise flickering across his worn features as he noticed the seriousness in Lucas's face. He accepted the journal and began flipping through its pages slowly, his weathered fingers careful with each turn. The room was still, save for the gentle crackle of fire and the soft rhythm of his breathing as he absorbed the words written by a woman long gone. Lucas sat beside him in silence, watching the changes in his grandfather's expression. At first, Samuel looked doubtful, but as he read deeper into the stories Caleb's mother had written, his eyes softened, though a shadow of something heavy remained. When he reached the passages about her bond with Fang, his brow furrowed, clearly struggling to believe it. He closed the journal gently and stood, walking slowly to the window. The pale winter sunlight filtered through the glass, casting soft lines across his face, lines carved by time, by loss, and by things left unsaid. Lucas's chest tightened as his grandfather finally spoke, voice low and worn. "You know, Lucas, I once had a friend, closer than a brother. George was a good man, kind. He loved this forest more than anyone I've ever met. He taught me everything I know about respecting every tree, every blade of grass." Samuel paused, as if gathering the strength to go on. Lucas said nothing. He sat still, afraid that any word might break the fragile moment of truth finally beginning to surface. "One winter day nearly 30 years ago," Samuel began, his voice low and rough, "George and I were patrolling the forest. We heard the pained roar of a bear in the distance. Without hesitation, George ran toward the sound, determined to save the poor creature from a trap. But when we got close, the bear couldn't understand his intentions. It turned and attacked, wild, terrified, in pain." His voice trembled. He raised a hand to his weathered face, as if trying to push the memory away before it could fully rise to the surface. "I was helpless, Lucas. I was just a few meters away, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't save him. In that moment, I realized something. There's a line between us and the wild that we are never meant to cross. George died in front of me, and ever since then, I haven't trusted any wild animal again." Lucas listened, his chest tightening. He understood now. The fear, the resistance, the cold caution in Samuel's eyes every time Fang was mentioned. It wasn't indifference. It was protection of a heart that had already been broken once and had spent decades guarding itself from breaking again. The pain and guilt of losing a friend had never healed. It had simply gone quiet, burning in the background like a slow ember that refused to die out. He stood and walked gently to his grandfather's side, resting a small hand on his shoulder. His voice was soft, careful. "Grandpa, I really do understand why you feel the way you do. What happened to Uncle George was heartbreaking, and I know it's something you've never truly let go of. But I just hope, maybe you could give Fang a chance. Not every wild creature is dangerous. Maybe Fang isn't like that bear." Samuel looked at him. For a brief moment, his eyes seemed tired, almost vulnerable. But the steadiness soon returned, and his voice, though calm, was resolute. "Lucas, I love you, and I promise I'll look into what Victor Hale's doing in that forest. But I'm not ready to trust Fang. Not the way you do. I need time." Lucas nodded. He knew better than to press further. Change didn't come all at once, but the fire in his heart burned brighter. He believed that with time, patience, and truth, the wall his grandfather had built over the years could be broken down, brick by brick. That evening, Lucas stepped outside and walked toward the edge of the woods, where Fang and his pack silently watched over Caleb's small cabin. From the shadows, Fang emerged. His golden eyes locked onto Lucas's, full of intelligence and a quiet understanding words could never fully express. Lucas moved closer, then sat down in front of the great black wolf. "My grandpa still doesn't trust you," he said softly. "But I promise, Fang, I'll do everything I can to prove you're not a threat. We're going to change his mind, maybe even change this whole town." Fang stared back, then stepped forward and settled beside him. His sleek, dark fur seemed to give off a quiet warmth, like a silent vow of trust. Lucas placed his hand on the wolf's head, feeling the strong, steady rhythm of its heartbeat beneath his palm. He made himself a silent promise. He would never give up, no matter how difficult it got. And in that cold, quiet moment of winter, deep in the forest, Lucas knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing Samuel's heart would take time. But between him and Fang, through empathy, patience, and an unshakable bond, he believed they could do it. Because healing a wound like Samuel's didn't come from fighting it. It came from walking beside it, gently, until it no longer hurt to remember. To expose Victor's crimes in a way that Samuel, and the people of Hollow Creek, could no longer ignore, Lucas and Caleb made a bold, dangerous decision. Night settled over Hollow Creek like a heavy blanket, draping rooftops and empty streets in a silent, frozen stillness. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving behind a thin crust of ice that cracked underfoot. The air was sharp enough to cut skin, but Lucas and Caleb no longer felt it. They stood huddled in the shadows of a narrow alley, eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of Hale Timber Company, the building where Caleb's father ran his entire operation. Its windows loomed like hollow eyes, empty and watchful, as if daring anyone to get too close. "This is our only shot," Caleb whispered, his eyes scanning the area with a sharp intensity. Lucas nodded, heart pounding against his ribs. He knew how reckless this was. Breaking into Victor Hale's office, stealing proof of his illegal logging. But without it, no one would believe them. No one would stop the wolf hunt. They crept along the building's side, keeping low until they reached the back door. Caleb had walked in and out of this place countless times as a kid, but tonight it felt unfamiliar, like enemy ground. He inhaled deeply and tested the door handle. Locked. Lucas glanced around, then crouched beside a low window near the ground. He gave it a gentle push. It opened just a crack. Caleb ducked down and slipped through first, followed by Lucas. They landed on the cold wooden floor in total darkness. The scent of old wood, ink, and paper filled the room. It was familiar to Caleb. To Lucas, it was tense and unfamiliar, like breathing in someone else's secrets. Caleb led them quietly to the back room. Victor's office. A massive wooden desk dominated the space, cluttered with folders and ledgers. Against the back wall stood a large bookshelf, and beneath it, a locked file cabinet. "It's got to be in here," Caleb murmured, dropping to one knee. His fingers traced the numbers on the combination lock. He'd seen his father open it once, years ago. Maybe the code hadn't changed. He turned the dial. A soft click echoed in the silence. Lucas held his breath as Caleb opened the drawer. Inside was a thick stack of folders, each one stamped in red with the word "confidential." They flipped through the pages. Illegal contracts, falsified reports, proof of bribery and cover-ups. It was all there. Lucas pulled out his phone and began snapping photos of every page. Caleb held the folders open, hands trembling. If the truth inside these files ever saw daylight, his father's empire would crumble. Then, click. A sound at the front door. Victor had returned, and he wasn't alone. Heavy footsteps followed him inside. A group of men, dressed in thick coats, hunting rifles slung over their backs, trailed behind. Flashlights cut through the dark hallways, sweeping across the old wooden floors in cold white beams. Lucas grabbed Caleb and bolted toward the window. They scrambled through just in time, but Victor spotted them. From inside the building, he caught a glimpse of two fleeing shadows disappearing into the tree line. Without hesitation, he signaled the others. "After them!" Lucas and Caleb sprinted into the night, their boots skidding across the ice-crusted snow. Behind them, the sound of pounding footsteps grew louder. Lucas pushed forward, his breath sharp in his chest. They couldn't head back into town. That's exactly where Victor would expect them to go. They crossed a frozen field, snow crunching under every step. Bare branches reached out like skeletal fingers in the dark. A gunshot rang out behind them, warning fire. The bullet slammed into a nearby tree with a violent crack. Caleb gasped beside him, his breath hot against the cold air. The snow swallowed their feet with every step, but they didn't stop. Lucas knew they were running out of options. The paths he used to trust now felt like traps. One wrong turn, and they could fall into a ravine or get cornered by the cliffs. His mind raced, trying to find a way out. But then, just as panic started to rise, he felt something. A presence. Quiet. Watching. And then, golden eyes. From the shadows of the trees, massive shapes began to emerge, one by one. Silent, powerful, Fang stepped forward first, his sleek black coat catching the pale moonlight, his eyes blazing like embers in the dark. Behind him, the rest of the pack followed, forming a protective circle around the two boys. The wolves didn't attack. They stood still, silent as sentinels guarding the forest, white clouds of breath rising from their mouths in the freezing air. Then, as the beams of flashlight swept closer, the wolves moved. No warning howl, no visible sign of aggression. In a blink, they shot forward like streaks of lightning through the trees, leaping straight toward the pursuers. Growls filled the night, mixing with startled screams. The hunters had no time to react before they were surrounded. A few rifles clattered to the snowy ground, flashlights fell and spun wildly, scattering erratic beams through the chaos. Lucas grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him backward into the cover of dense trees. "Go! Now!" They tore into the woods, swallowed instantly by the darkness. Behind them, the roars of the pack echoed. The wolves were protecting them. They didn't know how far they ran, only that by the time they stopped, their lungs burned and their legs trembled. Lucas hunched over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. Caleb collapsed onto a snow-covered rock, his face still pale with shock. No one followed. Only the silence of the forest remained, bathed in the weak glow of moonlight over the snow. Lucas was about to speak when his hand brushed the pocket of his coat, and felt nothing. His chest tightened. His phone, gone. The phone that held everything. The photos, the documents, the proof. His hands flew to every pocket, searching, checking. Nothing. Caleb noticed his expression and furrowed his brow. "What is it?" Lucas swallowed hard. I dropped my phone." Caleb froze, eyes widening. He didn't need Lucas to say more. They'd lost the one thing that could have exposed Victor Hale. After this, his father would double down, lock away the evidence, cover his tracks. There wouldn't be a second chance. The seed of hope. In the days that followed, Lucas and Caleb lived with the heavy weight of defeat. The phone, and everything inside it, was gone. At first, they barely dared to leave their homes, afraid Victor or one of his men had seen too much. The fear hung over them like a shadow. But it was in that quiet despair that something stirred in Lucas. A thought, a question. If you want to fight the dark, maybe the best way isn't to rage against it, but to light something small, something that grows. He shared the idea with Caleb one late afternoon. They sat beside a narrow stream, watching the dim sunlight filter through thick pine branches overhead. As Lucas spoke, Caleb listened in silence, his eyes slowly lighting up when Lucas proposed forming a small, secret group of young people who cared about the forest. A group that wouldn't just talk about change, but do something. Replant, rebuild, restore. The idea quickly took root. They started by reaching out to close friends, quiet conversations, cautious questions. At first, only a handful joined, but soon the spirit spread. The group grew, small but strong, determined. Their plan was simple. Once winter ended and the snow melted, they would begin. The ground was still frozen, too hard for planting. So for now, they spent their time mapping the forest, walking trails buried under snow, scouting spots for future planting, logging coordinates in notebooks with cold, aching hands. Each weekend morning, Lucas, Caleb, and their small group entered the woods together, faces red from the cold, hearts full of quiet hope. The chill bit at their skin, but the belief in something better kept them warm. And always, from the shadows, Fang and his pack watched. Protective. Present. At first, the wolves' silent presence made some in the group nervous, but slowly that changed. They began to recognize the golden eyes in the dark. They began to trust them, because deep down they understood. These wolves weren't watching for prey. They were guarding them. One cold winter afternoon, as Lucas and Caleb ventured deeper into the area near the creek to examine the soil, Lucas suddenly sensed something was off. He turned and saw a young wolf standing a short distance behind him. It wasn't Fang, but Lucas recognized it, one of the pack. The wolf's eyes were filled with cautious curiosity, like it was debating whether to approach or keep its distance. Lucas stayed perfectly still, heart beating fast, but not out of fear. After all this time with Fang and the pack, he'd come to understand that these wolves never meant harm. But just as he began to smile, hoping to ease the young wolf's hesitation, a gunshot tore through the still forest. The wolf yelped in pain, staggered back, then turned and fled into the trees, leaving behind a bright red smear of blood on the snow. Lucas spun around, stunned. Standing not far away was Mr. Jordan, one of the town's older residents, gripping a hunting rifle still smoking from the shot. His face was tight with fear and anger, muttering under his breath. Lucas ran toward him, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Why did you shoot it? It wasn't doing anything. It was just watching me." Mr. Jordan lowered the rifle, but his eyes remained hard and wary. He shook his head, speaking with firm conviction. "You're too naive, Lucas. I saw it. It was creeping up on you, ready to strike. I won't let wild animals like that hurt the children of this town." Lucas tried to explain, his words urgent and full of sincerity. "That's not true. These wolves have been following us for weeks. They've been protecting us. They're not dangerous like everyone thinks. You misunderstood them." But the old man only frowned, unconvinced. Years of fear, of passed-down stories about wild predators, weighed heavier than the truth of a boy's words. Without another word, he turned and walked quickly back toward town. Lucas stood frozen, a mix of dread and helplessness rising in his chest. Caleb rushed to his side, resting a hand on his shoulder, his voice low but filled with worry. "Lucas, he's going to tell everyone. This is going to get bad." And he was right. By the next morning, the rumor had spread like wildfire. Mr. Jordan had returned to town, saying the wolves were starting to attack children. He said Lucas and Caleb had recklessly wandered too deep into the forest and provoked the animals. His words sparked a wave of fear, and that fear turned quickly into anger. People in Hollow Creek, already wary and suspicious of the wolves, now believed without question that the pack was a real and immediate threat. The call to eliminate them grew louder by the hour. Lucas tried to speak to people, to explain what had really happened, but no one wanted to listen. Doubt and blame followed him everywhere. Accusing eyes, whispered conversations, doors that didn't open like they used to. The pressure was suffocating. Lucas felt the weight of it all. The isolation, the guilt. He hadn't meant for this to happen. And yet, by simply trying to understand the wolves, he had made them more vulnerable than ever. But beneath the regret, something inside him burned stronger than ever. He couldn't quit. He wouldn't quit. No matter how difficult it became, no matter how many people turned against him, he would keep fighting. For Fang, for the pack, and for the fragile hope that humans and nature didn't have to be enemies. He would prove that wolves were not monsters. And that belief, the quiet, stubborn belief in coexistence, would be his most powerful weapon against the fear gripping Hollow Creek. The tension in Hollow Creek had reached its peak. Worry and anger spilled through every narrow street, inside the grocery store, the cafe, the rows of tightly packed homes. The townspeople, already shaken by the wolves' bold appearances, were now consumed with outrage after hearing about Victor's group being attacked in the woods. Rumors spread like wildfire. "The wolves aren't afraid of humans anymore. They're getting aggressive. We can't let our children be at risk." Fearful whispers turned into furious chants, fueling an undercurrent that pushed everything further and faster. And Victor wasted no time seizing the moment. He stood before the crowd, his cold eyes scanning the anxious faces. This was exactly what he had been waiting for, a reason to wipe out the wolves and continue expanding his logging operations without resistance. Shouts erupted around him, fists clenched, heads nodded in agreement. No one stopped to question how the wolves had been driven to desperation in the first place. No one noticed the faint smirks on the faces of the hunters standing behind Victor. An official wolf hunt was declared. Dozens of men gathered in the center of town, armed with rifles and torches, ready to take back their woods. Some were seasoned hunters. Others were just frightened townsfolk swept up in panic and anger. They didn't understand wolves, didn't care why they had come so close. All they wanted was a quick solution. Among them, a man quietly reached for an old rifle. Samuel. He had never expected to hold that gun again. For years, it had sat untouched in the corner of his room, collecting dust like a silent monument to a past he tried to forget. But now, surrounded by the shouts and growing hysteria of the town, that past surged back, tightening around his chest like a vice. Samuel's eyes drifted toward the forest. That forest had taken George from him more than 30 years ago. And now, with people whispering that a wolf had nearly attacked Lucas, the fear returned, stronger than ever. It didn't matter what Lucas had said. It didn't matter what Caleb had tried to explain. All Samuel could think about was keeping his grandson safe, the boy he had promised himself he would never lose. Not the way he'd lost George. He couldn't believe that wolves could act the way Lucas claimed. To Samuel, wild animals would always be ruled by their primal instincts, and instincts couldn't be trusted. Sooner or later, instinct always won. All it would take was one slip, one moment too late, and Lucas could end up just like George. Samuel knew his decision would hurt his grandson. Maybe Lucas would never forgive him. But if that pain meant keeping him alive, Samuel was willing to carry it. He would face Lucas's disappointment. He would face his own nightmares. Because to Samuel, nothing mattered more than Lucas's life. And if protecting it meant picking up the rifle again, If it meant entering those woods where grief still lingered like fog, he would do it. Lucas couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stood frozen at the doorstep, ears ringing as the crowd's shouting and Victor's manipulations echoed in his mind. They were serious. They were going to kill Fang. The pack was in danger, and if he didn't act now, they would be gone. Without another thought, Lucas turned and ran, straight into the forest, blind to the snowstorm gathering on the horizon. The cold seeped deep into Lucas's flesh as he fumbled his way through the dense forest. He had been running without pause, desperate to outrun the torchlight of the hunting party, desperate to reach Fang in time to warn him. But time was not on his side. His legs had grown heavier with every step, and each breath felt frozen in the air before it could even fill his lungs. He could feel the heat slowly slipping from his body, realizing too late that he had misjudged the cost of fleeing into the wilderness on such a bitter night. The wind screamed through bare branches overhead, and the snow thickened beneath his feet, dragging his body deeper into a pale, endless blur. No sign of the wolves. No hint of direction. He didn't know where he was anymore, only that if he stopped now, the cold would swallow him whole. But no matter how much he pushed, his legs gave out beneath him. His vision blurred. The howling wind dulled to a whisper, leaving only the sluggish thud of his heartbeat in his ears. He recognized the signs. Hypothermia. He needed to get up. He needed to keep moving. But his strength had already abandoned him. Through the fog of falling snow, a dark shape flickered across his vision. A warm breath brushed against his face. Golden eyes lit up the darkness. He tried to speak, to call its name, but his voice was too weak, carried away by the wind before it ever reached the air. And then, more footsteps. 1, 2, 3 dark figures emerged from the snow, silent and steady. They didn't growl. They didn't charge. Instead, thick furred bodies pressed against him from all sides, shielding him from the biting wind. Lucas could feel their warmth, their breath slow and even. He didn't know how long he drifted in and out of that frozen haze, only that somewhere between the numbness and the dark, he no longer felt alone. When Lucas opened his eyes, snow still fell, but gently now, without the bitter wind. The warmth around him hadn't faded, and as his sight cleared, he could see the wolves still there, encircling him like a living shield. They hadn't left him. Not for a second. Fang stood the closest, his eyes sharp but calm. He wasn't about to leave, nor did he show a hint of aggression. Lucas realized it wasn't just that Fang had saved him. He was still protecting him, even now, from something Lucas hadn't yet understood. Their presence wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't just loyalty or some strange bond between him and Fang. Something was happening in this forest, and the wolves had sensed it long before any human had. Then the pack began to move, their paws gliding soundlessly across the snow. Lucas hesitated, legs still stiff and heavy, but he knew he had no other choice. Somehow, he trusted they were leading him somewhere he needed to go. Drawing a deep breath, he stood and followed, his breathing still ragged but steadier now that his body had begun to warm again. He didn't know where they were taking him, but they had stayed with him, and that was reason enough not to leave them. Soon, he saw a ridge rise before them, its rocky face streaked with moss and ice. Fang took the lead, guiding the pack into a wide cave naturally shielded from the wind and snow. Inside, the air was dim but noticeably warmer. As Lucas stepped in, he felt the ground's warmth begin to seep back into him, chasing away what cold still clung to his bones. The wolves moved confidently in the shadows, as if this place had always been theirs. Lucas sat in a corner, breathing deeply, letting his body rest while the storm passed outside. He hoped, silently, that the weather would delay the hunt, that maybe, just maybe, the townspeople would wait. Then a sound broke through the quiet. At first it was barely there, a faint rustle, but it grew louder. He stiffened, straining to listen. Footsteps, his heart slammed against his chest. There was no mistaking it now. The hunting party had followed his trail. The flicker of torchlight shimmered between the trees, drawing closer, faster than he had thought possible. If they saw the wolves, they would shoot. No warning, no hesitation. He had to do something. Now. The wolves had heard it too. They stood, fur bristling, alert. A few growled low in their throats, but Fang stayed motionless, his golden gaze locked coldly on the approaching figures. Lucas could feel the tension crackling in the cave like static. The pack was ready to fight if it came to that, but he couldn't let that happen. Lucas hurled himself down the snowy slope, slipping as his boots fought for grip, but he kept his balance, pushing forward. With only a few meters left between him and the hunting party, he shouted at the top of his lungs, hoping it wasn't too late to stop them. "Stop! Don't shoot!" The hunters flinched, many of them instinctively raising their rifles, eyes sharp with suspicion and caution. A voice called out, gravelly and familiar. "Lucas?" It was Samuel. Lucas scanned the group and spotted his grandfather standing among the hunters, both hands gripping his old rifle. But he wasn't alone. Victor was there too, his face unreadable, eyes narrowing as he spotted Lucas emerging from the direction of the wolves. Lucas knew he had only seconds. "They didn't attack me! The wolves! They saved me from the cold! They're not our enemies!" The hunters exchanged glances, no one speaking right away. They didn't believe him. Years of fear, of stories about wolves attacking humans had rooted too deep. The silence was thick, brittle. Lucas could feel the tension radiating from the men, the weight of their breath in the frozen air. Behind him, the wolves remained still, silent, yet unyielding. Then something unexpected happened. Fang stepped forward, but instead of growling or baring his teeth, he simply stood there, golden eyes fixed on Samuel. There was no anger in that gaze, no threat, only stillness. Lucas didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. These wolves were no longer just wild animals to him. They were protectors, and now he had to protect them in return. Samuel inhaled deeply, noticing how his hands trembled on the rifle's worn grip. This pack, the wolf standing before him, it wasn't what the townspeople thought it was. These creatures had lived in these woods long before any road or house had been built. They belonged here. This was their home. His breathing grew heavier as memories came rushing back, too vivid to ignore. He had once believed wolves brought only death, but now, looking at Fang, he saw he'd been wrong. They weren't predators to be feared. They were guardians, holding the line against the destruction people like Victor had brought. Slowly, Samuel lowered his gun. Gasps rippled through the group. They had come expecting a fight, expecting blood. But the oldest man among them, the one with the most scars, the most knowledge, was setting his weapon down. "Samuel, what are you doing?" one of the hunters called out, uncertainty in his voice. But Samuel didn't turn. His eyes never left Fang. He exhaled and shook his head. A long silence followed. One by one, the hunters looked at each other, unsure. This wasn't what they had prepared for. But then, slowly, reluctantly, they began to lower their weapons too. Victor was the only one who remained unmoved, standing rigid as his expression darkened. His voice rang out, sharp and tight. "Don't be foolish, Samuel. You really believe these wild animals are harmless. They'll come back. They'll attack again, just like they did with my men." But this time, no one backed him. The others had seen it for themselves. No aggression, no snarling, no sign of violence. The wolves had simply watched, still and calm, as though they'd been waiting. Lucas stood frozen, breath ragged, heart pounding. He couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. He had braced himself to fight, to defend the wolves with everything he had. But he didn't have to. Samuel had done it for him. Victor let out a sharp breath, his eyes sweeping across the hunters one last time. He saw the shift. The loyalty he once commanded had faded. With a scowl and a bitter shake of his head, he turned and stormed out of the forest, saying nothing more. The wolves didn't move. They waited, silent, as if for permission. Then, as the humans began to retreat, Fang blinked once, then turned calmly, leading the pack back into the shadows of the forest where they belonged. No panic, no fear. Lucas let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. When he looked at Samuel, he saw not fear in the old man's eyes, but something far more rare, understanding. "Thank you," Lucas whispered. Samuel didn't reply. He simply placed a warm, steady hand on his grandson's shoulder. After the encounter with Fang's pack in the forest, something inside Samuel began to shift. He walked slowly along the snow-covered path that led to the small cemetery nestled at the edge of Hollow Creek. Snow fell gently around him, draping the landscape in a calm, solemn silence that carried with it the weight of long-buried sorrow. Lucas walked beside him, quietly observing each movement, each deliberate step of his grandfather. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He knew this wasn't just a visit to pay respects to the dead. This was a moment of reckoning, a silent journey back to confront the ghosts that had followed Samuel for decades. They stopped in front of a simple gravestone, etched with the name George Allen. Samuel's hands trembled slightly. The years had passed, but the memory of his closest friend never faded. The image of George lying in the snow, his blood staining the white around him, was still vivid enough to tighten Samuel's chest. For years he had hidden from that pain, building a wall between himself and the wild, a force he had come to believe had stolen his friend. He knelt slowly, his aging hands brushing the snow from the stone. He drew in a deep breath, eyes glassy, voice low and thick with the weight of what had long gone unsaid. "George, it's been a long time since I came here. I've been running. I didn't have the courage to face the truth, that I couldn't save you. Since the day you died, I've blamed the forest. I've treated nature as the enemy, convinced it brings nothing but danger and death." Lucas stood silently behind him, saying nothing, simply listening with quiet respect. Samuel looked up at the gray sky as flakes drifted gently down, and his words became softer, like a confession to a soul he hoped was still listening somewhere beyond the cold. "That fear made me forget all the good you taught me about the wild. I was blind, selfish. I almost hurt my own grandson because I refused to believe him, because he tried to show me the truth about the wolves. I let the pain of the past twist me into someone I don't recognize." He bowed his head. Guilt sat heavy on his chest like a stone, a betrayal of the ideals he and George once shared, of harmony and stewardship with the natural world. He realized with painful clarity that his fear had turned him into a man George wouldn't have known. Then, from behind a snow-draped thicket, Fang emerged. Lucas turned in surprise, and Samuel followed his gaze, instinctively tensing at the sight of the large wolf. That old reflex stirred deep inside him. But then, something unexpected happened. Fang made no sound, showed no aggression. He moved slowly toward George's grave, then lay down beside Samuel, as if in quiet solidarity, sharing the grief rather than challenging it. Samuel didn't move. Every sense in him was alert, yet overwhelmed. Fang remained still, peaceful, his golden eyes filled not with menace, but with something gentler, patience, understanding. In that moment, something cracked open inside Samuel. He saw, with clarity he'd denied for too long, that Fang was not a soulless beast, but a creature with depth, with awareness, a being capable of compassion. Tears slid down his weathered face, hot against the chill in the air. After all these years of pain, fear, and denial, he finally saw the truth. Fang seemed to understand. He stayed where he was, silent, steady, offering a quiet forgiveness for all the suspicion Samuel had once held toward him. Turning to Lucas, Samuel's voice was soft, filled with remorse. For the first time, his gaze not harsh but warm, vulnerable. "I'm sorry, Lucas, I was wrong. I thought nature only brought pain, but it was me. I was the one hurting it. I let fear speak louder than what I once knew to be true." Lucas stepped forward, resting a firm but gentle hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "It's okay, Grandpa. What matters is, you understand now." Samuel rose to his feet, then turned to look at Fang with newfound respect and gratitude, emotions he had never thought he could feel for a creature of the wild. He understood now that he wasn't just letting go of fear, he was taking on a new responsibility. He would protect Fang, protect the pack, and stand against those who sought to destroy what little wilderness remained. He turned from George's grave, his heart lighter than it had been in years, even as he knew the road ahead would be steep, with Victor Hale and others like him waiting to tear the forest apart. But Samuel was no longer afraid. He had reclaimed the courage George had always wanted for him. Drawing a deep breath, he looked to Lucas with firm resolve. "From now on, I'm standing with you and Caleb. We're going to fight Victor. We're going to protect Fang and this forest, no matter what it takes. It's time I made things right." Lucas smiled, a warmth swelling in his chest, of pride, of hope. Samuel bowed his head one last time at George's grave, then turned and began walking away, Lucas at his side. And close behind them, quiet and steady, Fang followed, not just as a guardian of the woods, but as a friend, a comrade, stepping into the unknown with them toward the fight that was yet to come. Under the deepening twilight sky above Hollow Creek, dusk fell like a curtain of shadow, signaling the arrival of another long, bitter night. Tension rippled through the town like a chill in the air. Molly, a sweet, innocent 7-year-old girl, had vanished mysteriously earlier that afternoon. Dozens of townspeople fanned out across the landscape, flashlights and torches in hand, but the Whispering Pines forest was vast, and it seemed to have swallowed her whole without leaving behind the faintest trace. Samuel stood among the search party, his expression grave as he scanned the encroaching darkness. He looked up at the sky, the weight of age and helplessness pressing into his weathered gaze. Though his heart had begun to soften toward the natural world after everything that had unfolded, fear had not yet been fully erased from the minds of Hollow Creek's people. Some had come to trust Fang and his pack, but many others clung stubbornly to their belief that wolves were wild, unpredictable threats. Molly's disappearance, coming at such a delicate time, only deepened their suspicion. As night fell, a long, resonant howl pierced through the forest, drifting from deep within the trees and carrying across the hills like a mysterious call. The crowd stirred, murmurs of panic and doubt passing quickly between neighbors. Some men tightened their grips on hunting rifles, hearts racing with a single dreadful thought. What if the wolves had found Molly before they did? Lucas stood close to Samuel, eyes locked on the dense, blackened forest as the wolves' howls echoed again. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Grandpa, Fang and the pack, they wouldn't hurt Molly, would they?" Samuel looked down at the boy, and in Lucas's eyes he saw a hope so raw, so bright, that it pierced through his own uncertainty. In that moment, something stirred in him. Not only the need to find Molly, but the quiet conviction to prove, once and for all, that the wolves were not the enemy. Then Fang appeared. He emerged from the tree line at the edge of town, his sleek black figure strong and silent under the silver light of the moon. The crowd froze, every gaze snapping to the wolf. Several rifles lifted instinctively, but before anyone could act, Samuel stepped forward and raised his voice, calm but commanding. "Wait, lower your weapons. We need to trust him." His words rang out, firm and unwavering, slicing through the tension like a blade. The crowd stilled. Fang showed no fear, his golden eyes fixed on Samuel, conveying something urgent, something that didn't need words. Samuel took a careful step forward, heart pounding but filled with trust. In Fang's gaze, he saw more than instinct. He saw intention, intelligence. The wolf tilted his head, then turned slowly toward the forest, glancing back as if inviting them to follow. Samuel turned to the others, voice steady. "I believe he's trying to lead us to Molly. Follow him." There was a moment of hesitation. Then, one by one, the crowd began to move, falling into step behind Samuel and the wolf. The search party flowed into the woods, passing through thickets and over slippery moss-covered rocks, guided by Fang's steady pace. Every few steps, Fang would pause, glance back, silently checking that the humans were still with him. The deeper they traveled into the forest, the more people began to feel it, the urgency in the wolf's movements, the certainty of his direction. Suspicion gave way to wonder. Somewhere along that path, fear transformed into awe. After nearly half an hour of walking through the dense woods, Fang stopped at a quiet clearing, bathed in moonlight and carpeted with soft grass. Everyone held their breath, and then, there she was. Molly lay curled gently in the grass, fast asleep, her face peaceful and unaware of the chaos that had consumed the town in her absence. Lucas rushed forward and knelt beside her, shaking her shoulder gently, voice thick with emotion. "Molly, are you okay? We've all been looking for you." The girl stirred, blinking sleepily. "I was just playing. I got tired. And then I couldn't remember the way back." A hush fell over the group. No one said a word. They could only watch, overwhelmed, as the truth settled in. Fang had led them here. He had brought them to her, not out of instinct, but out of care. The black wolf stood quietly a few steps away, observing with calm restraint, as if he too understood that his role had come to an end. Samuel stepped toward him, his movements slow and deliberate. He extended a hand, not to command, but to thank. "Thank you, Fang," he said, voice thick with reverence. "I trusted you, and you didn't let me down. Now this town will finally understand. The wolves aren't our enemies, they're our friends." Fang's eyes flickered in the dark, catching the moonlight. For a moment it seemed as though he understood every word. Then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared once more into the forest's embrace. And from that night forward, something shifted in the hearts of Hollow Creek. The fear and hatred that had once clouded their vision slowly began to lift. The wolves they had once hunted and cursed became symbols of quiet protection, guardians of the forest, and of the people who had finally opened their eyes. A new chapter had begun, forged not through force, but through faith, through the courage of a boy, the redemption of an old man, and the silent loyalty of a black wolf who had never once asked for anything in return. As winter slowly loosened its grip, and the pale light of spring began to filter through the trees, the warmth and hope that Lucas had quietly longed for never came. On the surface, things in Hollow Creek seemed to settle. Calmer days, quieter streets. But deep within the forest, he knew a shadow was growing. Victor hadn't abandoned his ambitions. He had simply grown more cautious, more calculated. The illegal logging didn't stop. It just disappeared into the dark, buried beneath silence and precision. The trucks no longer parked openly at the forest's edge. They arrived under the cover of night, slinking through the woods like patient predators. The workers moved in silence, keeping their heads down, aware that what they were doing wasn't something to be discussed openly. Victor had already bought off the people who mattered, and those who dared to speak out were quietly pushed aside, threatened into silence, or worse, written out of the story altogether. It was Caleb who first noticed the shift. He'd been watching his father for weeks, documenting movements, capturing photos, collecting evidence in secret. But one night, while trying to photograph a truck overloaded with stolen timber, he was caught. Victor didn't shout, didn't plead like a father desperate to change his son's mind. He simply looked at Caleb with a cold, calculated stare, a man who no longer saw blood, only threats. Caleb was locked in his room that same night. His phone was confiscated. All that remained were 4 walls and the bitter taste of disappointment. But it wasn't the confinement that cut deepest. It was the realization that his father hadn't hesitated. There was no shame, no flicker of remorse, just the quiet efficiency of someone who had planned for this. Lucas, meanwhile, was no better off. He had lost the most vital piece of evidence. The phone that had once held photos, records, undeniable proof of Victor and Sheriff Brooks' crimes. It had slipped from his pocket the night they fled through the woods, and despite returning more than once to look for it, it was gone. Without it, there was no way to prove anything. Lucas was left grasping at memories, trying to convince people with words alone in a town that had already made its peace with silence. He tried anyway. He spoke with teachers, store owners, neighbors, anyone who might still care. But most just looked away, or changed the subject, or offered vague words of sympathy without commitment. Not because they didn't know what was happening, but because they were afraid to give up the illusion of peace that Victor provided. The adults of Hollow Creek had made their choice. They would let Whispering Pines fall, brick by brick, tree by tree, for the sake of stability. But Lucas couldn't follow them into that silence. He knew this wasn't just about the forest anymore. It was about what the town was becoming. And even if he had to stand alone, he would not turn away. But the forest had its limits. From deep within Whispering Pines, where the last ancient trees still stood, nature had begun to stir. The machines returned. Cold, grinding, relentless. The dry, metallic whine of chainsaws cut through the stillness, severing more than just trees. The forest shook, groaned, broke open. Mighty trunks fell, their age and history scattered in splinters, laid bare like corpses beneath the indifferent hands of men. And this time, nature did not remain silent. A spark, small, insignificant, caught in the jammed teeth of a saw between two massive trunks. A flicker, a breath of light, and then fire. It roared to life, fast and furious, as though the forest itself had drawn breath and exhaled fury. Flames curled around dry leaves, leapt from branch to branch, crawled through the underbrush like a living, raging beast awakened after a long slumber. In seconds, fire painted the woods red. The smoke rose thick and dark, swallowing the sky in soot and ash. The machines stopped. Workers screamed. Panic took over. The spring winds, once gentle, turned traitorous, fanning the flames, driving them farther and faster, tearing through the trees with a vengeance. What had been a forest moments ago became a wall of fire, consuming everything in its path. The blaze surged downward toward Hollow Creek, riding the wind, bringing with it heat and chaos that turned the quiet town into a scene of devastation. People ran, shouted, wept. Parents screamed for their children. The elderly stumbled, clutching loved ones. Children cried, dragged by trembling hands toward safety that no longer felt guaranteed. Streets once calm and familiar became choked with smoke. Ash fell like snow. The sky turned the color of rust. And as the inferno bore down on Hollow Creek, it was no longer just a town in danger. It was a town finally facing the consequence of what it had ignored for too long, the wrath of a forest betrayed. At the very height of despair, from deep within the burning forest, a series of long, echoing howls cut through the roar of fire, urgent, unmistakable, like a warning siren rising from the heart of nature itself. The crowd of townspeople stopped, startled and uneasy, some looking toward the trees with fear in their eyes. But Lucas recognized it immediately. It was Fang and his pack. He shouted, calling for everyone to trust them, to follow the sound of the howls, to escape. A group of townsfolk hesitated only briefly before choosing to believe him, scrambling to keep up as Fang emerged through the smoke, his dark form moving confidently ahead, guiding them down narrow, winding trails only the wolves could have known. Yet not everyone had the courage or trust to follow an animal they had spent their whole lives fearing. Many remained frozen where they stood, or turned back toward the paths they were familiar with, paths they thought would lead them to safety. But the forest no longer played by their rules. Fire surged again, furious and unforgiving, sealing those familiar exits with towering walls of flame. Cries rang out, shouts for help, voices calling names, children wailing in the chaos. The smoke thickened, the heat grew unbearable, and the town fell into a maelstrom of panic. On the other side, Fang pressed forward, leading the first group along twisting roots, weaving between fallen branches and burning brush. His glowing eyes never flinched, not even as the smoke clawed at the air and the fire licked at their heels. He kept glancing back to check on the people following him, ensuring no one fell behind. Lucas ran close behind, his heart full of hope, though the screams from deeper in the forest echoed painfully in his ears, a grim reminder of what fear and arrogance had brought upon them all. The fire showed no sign of stopping. If anything, it seemed to rage harder, as though punishing those who had ignored its warnings. For those left behind, there was nothing left but prayer, prayers for survival and for mercy from a force they had spent too long misunderstanding. The forest was no longer forgiving. Amid the growing inferno, Lucas and Samuel plunged back into the chaos, refusing to give up on those still trapped. The smoke burned their lungs, and the light of the flames cast grotesque shadows across their faces as they pressed deeper, desperate to reach the cries for help that pierced the roar of fire. Lucas heard them clearly, small, terrified voices somewhere beyond the blaze. His chest tightened. He couldn't see who was calling out, but he didn't hesitate. He moved. Samuel stayed close, his aging eyes sharp, his hand gripping Lucas's shoulder whenever he stumbled. But the heat bore down like a hammer, and soon they were encircled. Fire on all sides, smoke choking every breath. Samuel coughed violently, struggling to stay upright, while Lucas felt panic crawl up his spine. A massive tree, weakened by the flames, crashed down just feet away, sparks erupting into the air like a warning shot from nature itself. They backed away instinctively, knowing they had nowhere left to run. Then, through the wall of smoke, familiar shapes emerged, shadows at first, then clearer. Wolves. The pack appeared like spirits conjured from the fire itself, moving with eerie calm through the chaos. Fang led them, eyes sharp as molten gold, fur dusted with ash. He howled, one long, powerful sound that cut through the blaze, and the others moved, forming a circle around Lucas and Samuel. They didn't attack. They didn't flee. They stood guard, creating a living barrier between the humans and the fire. Fang stepped closer to Lucas, his gaze steady, his presence unwavering, as if to say, "You are safe. We will not leave you." But fate was not yet done testing them. Above Lucas, a loud crack split the air. A burning branch, scorched through, gave way and began to fall, straight toward him. Samuel shouted, reaching out with everything he had, but he was too far. Time slowed. Lucas didn't even have a chance to move. Then, like lightning, Fang leapt from the ground. His body arched through the smoke, powerful and precise, colliding with Lucas just in time to knock him clear. In that fleeting, breathless instant, Lucas felt Fang's full weight slam into him. Not with violence, but with purpose. The heavy branch crashed to the ground right beside Fang, sending up a cloud of ash and charred dust. Lucas tumbled to the ground, stunned, his heart nearly stopping at the sight of Fang lying motionless. He scrambled to his feet and rushed to his loyal friend. In the flickering light of the flames, he saw Fang struggling to lift himself, his legs trembling, his once silver coat singed and darkened by the fire. Yet Fang's eyes still burned bright, not with blame or fear, but with concern, locked on Lucas as if to silently ask if he was hurt. That moment shattered something inside Lucas. The tears came fast, unchecked, burning down his cheeks as the weight of everything hit him all at once. Around them, townspeople had arrived just in time to witness the scene, and for the first time, they truly saw. They saw not a wild beast, not a threat, but a protector, brave, loyal, and full of a love so selfless it left them speechless. Fang, the wolf they once feared, had risked everything for a human child. The pack kept moving, guiding the remaining townsfolk away from the danger. Samuel helped Lucas to his feet, his eyes glassy with emotion and newfound respect. Whatever lingering doubts had remained in his heart vanished in that sacred, undeniable moment. As they neared the edge of the fire zone, Lucas turned back to look at Fang, his hero limping behind them, worn and wounded but proud. In those eyes, Lucas saw not just a wolf, but a symbol of friendship, of sacrifice, of the possibility of harmony between human and nature. He and Caleb quickly realized that Fang was in critical condition. The air remained thick with smoke, forcing them to crouch low just to breathe. Fang lay still on the ground, his chest rising and falling with worrying weakness. His once glorious coat was now matted with soot and scorched in patches. Caleb immediately removed his coat and draped it over Fang's body, trying to smother the lingering embers still clinging to the wolf. Lucas dashed to a nearby stream, soaked a blanket he had brought, and returned to carefully lay it over Fang's burns. Kneeling close, Lucas placed his hand on Fang's chest, feeling the weak but present rhythm of life. The warmth was still there, but so faint it frightened him. Fang's eyes fluttered open, no longer fierce, but tired and aching. Lucas leaned close, whispering shakily, "Hang on, Fang. You saved me. Now let me save you." As if understanding, Fang blinked slowly, trust unwavering in that fragile gaze. Caleb returned with more water, soaking his own shirt to cool the wolf's head. They said nothing more. There was no need. Every movement, every breath was focused on saving Fang. From the smoke beyond, townspeople began to gather. Some hesitated at first, unsure, but when they saw Fang's battered body, witnessed the raw truth of his bravery, something shifted. One man stepped forward, carrying a large water jug. He approached Lucas hesitantly, then knelt beside him and offered it quietly. "Help him," he said. "He deserves to live. We were wrong." Lucas looked up and recognized him. It was the same man who had once insisted the wolves were dangerous, had rallied the town to hunt them. But now, his eyes were filled with remorse. Lucas nodded, accepted the water, and continued tending to Fang with even greater care. Samuel moved closer as well. His face was solemn, his expression resolute. He laid a trembling hand on Lucas's shoulder and said with quiet conviction, "We won't leave him, Lucas. Fang saved us all. It's our turn to protect him now." Those words, steady and sure, brought a sense of calm that Lucas hadn't felt in days. Beside him, Caleb exhaled slowly, a flicker of hope brightening his face as he watched both his father and the town begin to transform. Under their combined care, Fang's breathing steadied. The pain hadn't left his eyes, but there was light in them again. Lucas could feel it. He was still fighting. The road to recovery would be long, but right now, none of that mattered. Fang was alive. Gently stroking his soot-covered fur, Lucas made a silent vow that this wolf would never be left to suffer alone again. As the last golden rays of the day fell over the blackened forest, the people of Hollow Creek formed a quiet circle around Lucas, Caleb, Samuel, and Fang. No one spoke. There were no speeches, no declarations, just silence and awe, a deep shared recognition that something profound had happened. In that stillness, surrounded by smoke and scorched earth, a new bond had taken root. A bond that, for the first time, promised a future built not on fear, but on trust. After the devastating wildfire, Hollow Creek looked like a town stripped bare of the peaceful shell it once wore. All around were charred tree trunks, skeletal and lifeless, their branches buried under a thick layer of ash. The air was suffocating with smoke and the acrid stench of burned wood. Families who had lost their homes wandered in despair, their eyes reflecting the flames that had just consumed everything they held dear. At that moment, everyone asked themselves the same question. What had truly caused this catastrophe? But in the midst of that bleak atmosphere, a flicker of hope sparked. When Lucas unexpectedly found the phone he had lost during the night, he fled from Victor Hale's pursuers. It was lying nestled in the ashes near the small wooden cabin, once the secret meeting place for him and Caleb. At first, Lucas felt crushed, convinced that all the precious data had been lost to the fire. But when he pressed the power button, a weak light flickered to life on the screen, and his heart began pounding with renewed hope. Lucas quickly handed the phone to Caleb. The two boys stayed up through the night, carefully recovering and copying each photo and document that remained in the memory. Inside were undeniable pieces of evidence showing Victor Hale's destruction of the forest. Ancient trees, hundreds of years old, had been felled without mercy, their massive trunks loaded onto trucks for sale, leaving behind gaping stumps and layers of dry leaves, the perfect fuel for a wildfire during the dry season. The files revealed, in painful clarity, the greed and recklessness of those who had exploited the forest with no regard for the natural world or the lives of the townspeople. Without hesitation, Lucas brought the evidence to the people of Hollow Creek. At first, they exchanged skeptical glances, but faced with such undeniable proof, suspicion turned into outrage. Voices began to rise. Eyes once filled with confusion now burned with anger and accusation. Everyone began to understand. The fire had not just been a natural disaster, it was the consequence of human greed. "We trusted Victor," Lucas said, standing before the crowd, his voice steady but heavy with pain. "But he used our trust to profit off the life of this forest. The trees he cut down weren't just lifeless logs. They held moisture. They slowed the spread of fire. When Victor destroyed the forest, he turned our town into a giant torch, waiting for the smallest spark to set it ablaze." The more Lucas spoke, the quieter the townspeople became, overwhelmed by shock and regret. The felled trees now stood like solemn witnesses to their mistakes. Once, they had seen the forest only as an economic resource, an endless supply of wood to be harvested. But now, they realized that it was their own hands that had fed the fire which consumed their homes. Some hung their heads in silence. Others wept openly in shame. The blindfolds they had worn for so long were torn away, and the painful truth lay bare before them. The forest was not just a collection of trees. It had been their shield, the home of countless wild creatures, and a loyal companion they had taken for granted. As the pale golden light of sunset washed over the ruined town, Samuel stepped forward to stand beside the two boys. His voice was low and hoarse, but resolute as it echoed across the silent gathering. "We brought this disaster upon ourselves with our own neglect. Now is the time to change. The forest doesn't need people, but people cannot live without the forest." His words rang out like a final wake-up call. For the first time in many years, the people of Hollow Creek finally understood. The forest was worth far more than any money Victor or anyone else had ever promised. That night, for the first time since the fire, the townspeople gathered, not to point fingers or lay blame, but to figure out how to make amends and protect what remained. Their eyes no longer burned with suspicion toward the wolves, but with gratitude as they recalled how Fang and his pack had risked everything to guide them out of the flames. One voice at a time, one quiet vow after another, merged into a powerful promise. We will never turn our backs on nature again. And though no official trial had yet taken place, everyone in Hollow Creek knew that Victor Hale and Sheriff Tom Brooks would soon have to face justice, not only in the court of law, but in the judgment of every conscience in town. But more than that, what truly mattered now was a renewed understanding of their duty to protect the natural world and the future of the generations to come. That was the real trial, one whose verdict would echo louder than any gavel ever could. Night had fallen over Hollow Creek when Victor Hale began packing in secret. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. The truth had been exposed. His illegal logging operations were in ruins, and the town was no longer a place where he could hide. And yet even now, there was not a trace of real remorse in his heart. What consumed him wasn't guilt. It was anger. Anger that he had been caught, that the carefully built image of success and power he had maintained for years had finally crumbled. To him, the forest had always been nothing more than a means to an end, a resource to exploit. Nature, and all the values people spoke of so highly, morality, balance, respect, were just hollow words, meaningless to a man like him. He yanked the zipper closed on a suitcase stuffed with cash, enough to start a new life anywhere he pleased. Just then, Caleb stepped into the room, his expression caught between disappointment and quiet resolve. "You can't keep running," Caleb said firmly. "You need to stay and face what you've done." Victor scoffed without even looking at his son. In his mind, Caleb was still a boy, too naive to understand how the world really worked. "Do you know what money can buy, Caleb? Conscience, reputation, loyalty. They're all just commodities waiting to be exchanged. I'll go where no one cares about forests or some wild wolves." But Caleb didn't flinch. He simply shook his head. "You're wrong, and I'll never follow you again." For a moment, Victor froze, but he quickly shoved the feeling aside and stormed out of the house. His car sped into the night, leaving behind the helpless gaze of his son and the anger of a town now ready to pursue him. Deep in the dark, Victor took a narrow dirt road that led into the scarred remains of the forest. But the night betrayed him. While fleeing, his car slammed into a fallen tree, thick and blackened from the fire. He was injured, a deep gash above his brow bleeding heavily, his leg in searing pain. Limping, confused and panicked, he staggered into the shadows, desperate to escape the searchers now closing in. Time slowed into a fog of agony. He slumped against a scorched trunk, trying to think, to plan, but pain and fear clouded everything. Then, through the icy silence, a howl echoed, long, sharp, and haunting. Victor's pulse surged. He looked up into the darkness. Two glowing yellow eyes pierced the night. Fang. And behind him, the pack. Victor gasped, expecting this to be the end, the forest's vengeance come alive. But the wolves didn't strike. Instead, they moved in close, forming a protective circle around him, growling not at him, but at something else. Emerging from the distant tree line, another pack advanced. Snarling, more aggressive, drawn in by the chaos after the fire, attempting to invade Fang's territory. But Fang held his ground in front of Victor, body scarred and fur still singed in patches. Yet his eyes burned with unshakable purpose. He stood firm, not to kill, but to defend. Victor was stunned. The man who had spent his life exploiting the forest, who had seen wolves as enemies, now found himself protected by them. Risked for, even. That moment, raw and overwhelming, struck through his hardened heart like lightning. The rogue pack retreated, unable to match Fang's will. When the danger passed, Fang turned to Victor, his eyes glowing not with vengeance, but something more powerful, dignity, and a quiet forgiveness. That look pierced deeper than any wound Victor had ever known. For the first time in years, his tears came freely. For the first time he saw how wrong he had been, how blind he had let greed make him. At dawn, the townspeople found him. The sight was almost impossible to believe. The man they despised most, lying injured yet protected by the very wolves they had once feared. Victor saw Caleb, Lucas, and Samuel, and lowered his head, shame washing over him in waves. His voice trembled, no longer proud, no longer defiant. "I was wrong, Caleb. Everything you said, it was all true. Nature, the creatures that live here, they deserve to be protected, respected. I'm sorry it took me this long to see that." His words melted into the quiet of the forest, but to those who stood there, they echoed louder than any speech. In the first light of day, Hollow Creek began to rise from its ashes, with a renewed belief that compassion, understanding, and love for the natural world could heal even the deepest of wounds. And Victor Hale, the man who once seemed beyond redemption, had finally found his conscience, held not in a courtroom, but in the silent, majestic mercy of the wild. Under the cold white light of the courtroom, the lines etched into Victor Hale's face spoke of time and greed more than age. In the heavy silence of the trial chamber, He sat motionless, his tired eyes fixed on his tightly clasped hands, as if they could somehow hide the guilt that was now too glaring to deny. Across from him, the prosecutor laid out, piece by piece, the evidence, the photographs capturing the devastating consequences Victor had inflicted upon the forest. But in Victor's vacant stare, it wasn't those horrifying images that seemed to play before him, but distant memories long buried beneath ambition and denial. Bitter, bleak fragments of a childhood scarred by hardship. Born into poverty in Hollow Creek, Victor had grown up surrounded by scarcity. He had watched his parents toil endlessly just to keep the family afloat. The dilapidated house he called home never had enough food, and the winters brought a cold that bit into his bones, with clothes too thin to keep the chill away. From those years came a persistent fear, a fear of helplessness, of never having enough. It was that fear that planted the idea in his young mind that money was the only true salvation, that wealth, and wealth alone, could promise the safety he had never known as a boy. In adulthood, after meeting and marrying the only woman he ever truly loved, it seemed, for a time, that life had finally offered him peace. Elizabeth was gentle, grounded, and deeply connected to the natural world. She regularly volunteered in conservation efforts and believed that nature wasn't something to conquer, but something to coexist with. She had been a beacon of light in Victor's life, showing him that meaning could be found beyond the endless pursuit of wealth. But her sudden death in a tragic accident shattered that fragile peace. Victor, hollowed by grief, plunged even deeper into his obsession with success. Accumulating wealth became a shield against vulnerability, a way to bury sorrow beneath layers of control. And from that moment, Victor ceased to be the man he once was. Cold and calculating, he began to measure life in profit margins, disregarding morality for gain. The illegal deforestation of Whispering Pines was just one in a long line of destructive decisions. But this time, the cost was far greater. A raging fire nearly erased Hollow Creek from the map, taking lives and endangering countless more, human and animal alike. Beside Victor sat Tom Brooks, once the town's most trusted sheriff, now facing charges of conspiracy and corruption. He too sat in silence, head bowed. Tom had always been a decent man, respected, responsible, committed to justice. But mounting family troubles and crushing gambling debts had left him desperate. When Victor came offering a lifeline in exchange for silence, Tom took it. At first, he thought he could look the other way just once or twice, then walk away. But the promises became chains. Slowly, Tom lost his integrity, his pride, and the ethical foundation of the job he once cherished. Now, with everything exposed, he realized he hadn't just lost his career, he had lost himself, and the respect of the very people he had sworn to protect. When the prosecutor presented the final piece of evidence, images showing Victor handing Tom cash, the lives of both men were laid bare. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, thick with disappointment. Victor shut his eyes, unable to meet anyone's gaze. For the first time, he felt the brutal weight of a truth he could no longer buy his way out of. Money could never restore trust or dignity. The verdicts were clear. The court proceedings closed, but the wounds they had inflicted on Hollow Creek would take far longer to heal. Outside the courthouse, residents gathered in somber clusters, reflecting not only on the crimes of two men, but on the silence that had enabled them. This trial wasn't just about Victor and Tom. It was about the conscience of an entire community, because it was their silence, too, that allowed the forest to be desecrated. In the days that followed, Hollow Creek began to shift. People saw more clearly than ever the cost of indifference, the weight of human greed. They began to take responsibility, planting new trees, organizing recovery efforts, and dedicating themselves to a future that would honor the land they had once taken for granted. As for Victor and Tom, they were left to face the consequences of their actions. Yet beyond the legal sentences that awaited them, the far greater punishment lay in the lessons now etched into their souls. Lessons about greed, about the fragile limits of nature's patience, and about the tragedy of losing oneself in the blind pursuit of wealth. After Victor Hale was arrested and held accountable by the law for his wrongful actions, Caleb Hale sank into a period of overwhelming turmoil and silent anguish. His family shattered like a shard of cold, splintered glass, reflecting a loneliness and confusion he had never imagined before. Though Caleb had stood on the side of nature, on the side of what was right, he couldn't escape the complicated feelings festering inside. He loved his father, even if that man had done terrible things, and the pain only deepened each time Caleb caught the judgmental, accusing eyes of people in Hollow Creek. At first, the townspeople didn't just look at Caleb with suspicion and resentment. They expressed it openly, even cruelly. Every time he walked into the general store or crossed the town square, the whispers stung like invisible blades. Some said outright that he bore part of the blame for his father's crimes, that he must have known and done nothing to stop them. These harsh accusations pushed Caleb deeper into isolation and despair. Some went as far as refusing to sell him goods or allow him to participate in any community activities, as if he were a living embodiment of Victor Hale, the man who destroyed the forest and nearly burned the town to the ground. Caleb once overheard an elderly woman mutter bitterly, "If it weren't for your father, we wouldn't have lost the forest or nearly lost our lives. You should disappear just like he did." That sentence replayed in his mind night after night, a haunting refrain that slowly closed him off from the world, turning him into a shadow walking silently through the town he used to call home. But in the depths of that despair, Caleb realized that the only way out of the shadow his father had left behind wasn't to run. It was to face it, to repair what had been broken. From that moment on, even as cold stares and rejection followed him, Caleb began to show up at tree planting events, at wildlife protection efforts in the sanctuary and the land surrounding the town. Slowly he became a familiar face among the volunteers, never hesitating to get his hands dirty, sowing seeds into the earth, carefully tending to each sapling, each injured animal still recovering from the fire. It was Lucas and Mr. Samuel who reached out to him first. One late afternoon, with the last light of day slipping gently through the window pane, Lucas quietly stepped into Caleb's room. Samuel close behind, his eyes filled with empathy and understanding. Neither of them came to blame or ask questions that would reopen old wounds. Lucas looked at him with honesty and quiet conviction and said, "Caleb, none of us gets to choose the family we're born into, but we all get to choose the kind of person we want to be. What you did, standing up for the forest, even knowing it meant going against your own father, that's what shows who you really are. You don't have to carry the weight of his mistakes. What matters is that you chose to stand on the side of nature, on the side of what's right." Samuel gently placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder and added in a low voice, "I know how hard that burden can feel. But you need to understand, your father's mistakes are not yours. Don't let the past hold you back from walking the path you've already had the courage to begin." And in that moment, for the first time in many long, silent days, Caleb felt truly seen. The sincerity and quiet care from Lucas and Mr. Samuel were like a small, flickering flame, faint at first, but enough to begin warming a heart that had been frozen for far too long. In their presence, Caleb found a spark of hope and the strength to keep going. Starting the very next day, Caleb began actively participating in the restoration efforts for the Whispering Pines forest. He spent hours planting trees, gently burying tiny seeds into the soil. Each time his hands pressed those seeds into the damp earth, it felt like he was sowing hope, new dreams to take root in the very place where his father's mistakes had once scarred the land. He also took it upon himself to care for injured wildlife, nursing small creatures with a patience and tenderness that came from deep within. Day by day, Caleb slowly reclaimed his confidence, shedding the heavy shadow of his father's legacy. The townspeople of Hollow Creek, once cold and guarded, gradually began to shift their views as they witnessed Caleb's tireless, honest work. The glances once filled with suspicion softened into something closer to understanding, perhaps even respect. Caleb realized then that the only way to truly confront the mistakes of the past was to take responsibility for healing what had been broken. At first, many still looked the other way, choosing to ignore him. But over time, his quiet persistence wore down their indifference. They saw him out there every morning by the fragile green sprouts, carefully tending to them. They saw him wrapping bandages around tiny, wounded animals. They saw him staying late into the night at the sanctuary, always doing a little more, as though mending the forest was a duty he had taken on for life, a way to repay a debt he didn't even owe. One day, as Caleb was carefully planting saplings alongside Lucas and a few other volunteers, Mary, the very woman who had once spoken harshly to him, approached in silence, watching him from a short distance. Caleb noticed her and felt a familiar knot of anxiety twist in his stomach. But before he could say a word, her voice trembled through the quiet. "Child, I was wrong about you. You didn't have to do all this alone, and yet you never stopped. You've done what your father couldn't, what we all should have done long ago." From that moment on, something shifted in the town. The hostility and isolation began to give way to compassion, even admiration. People began to see not just a boy burdened by his father's sins, but someone brave enough to carry that weight without resentment. Someone who chose to build instead of destroy. Each time Caleb stepped onto the main street, the scornful stares no longer followed him. The muttered accusations had faded, replaced by warm nods, encouraging smiles, and kind questions. The people of Hollow Creek now saw Caleb as a symbol of resilience and redemption, a young man dedicating himself fully to righting a wrong he never committed. To them, Caleb was no longer Victor Hale's son. He had become the boy who plants the forest, a leader among the town's youth, restoring not only the land but the values the town once feared were lost forever. And in doing so, Caleb taught everyone a truth far more enduring than any trial or punishment. What defines us is not who we come from, but who we choose to become. In the golden light of late afternoons, Caleb often stood on a hillside overlooking the slowly reviving forest, green shoots pushing through the ash, defiant and alive. His thoughts would wander to his father, to the choices he had made, and he'd feel a complex mix of sorrow and strange peace. He knew the family he once had was no longer the same. But in its place, he had found something just as meaningful. Genuine friends, kindred spirits who shared his love for the natural world. For the first time in his life, Caleb felt truly free to be himself. No more harsh stares, no more bitter words, only pride in what he was building, and a quiet joy in reclaiming what had been lost. He made a promise to himself that day, to devote his life to protecting nature, and to hold on to the hope that one day his father might understand, and be proud of the path his son had chosen. The work of restoring the forest was no longer just the mission of Lucas and Caleb. The two boys who once stood quietly against greed and ignorance were now leading a movement that carried meaning and inspiration for the entire town, to bring back the beloved forest of Hollow Creek. Lucas and Caleb began organizing meetings at the community center. At first, only a handful of young people showed up, but it wasn't long before families, elders, and even those who had once doubted the wolves began to join. They came not only to lend a hand, but to make amends for their silence, for their indifference. The work started with clearing the scorched wood, digging through layers of dead earth to find the life still hidden underneath. Lucas taught everyone how to choose strong seeds, hardy saplings full of vitality, symbols of a fresh start. Each young tree planted held the town's renewed hope, a promise that this time they would not turn their backs on nature. As people toiled, Fang and his pack, though not yet fully recovered from the fire, continued to appear near the reforestation sites. At first, their presence still caused unease, But when townsfolk saw how the wolves kept quiet watch, guarding the area from other wildlife that might disturb the new plantings, a deeper understanding began to take root. There was meaning here in the way humans and animals coexisted, not by chance, but by choice. One clear morning, as the sun rose gently through the remaining treetops, Caleb stood before the gathered people of Hollow Creek. His eyes were bright, steady, and calm as he addressed them. We've seen what happens when greed blinds us, when nature becomes the unwilling victim. This forest, our shared home, was abandoned by us, and we paid the price with our very lives. But nature, in its endless generosity, always gives second chances. This is ours, and we must not waste it. He paused for a moment, glancing toward Fang and the wolves sitting quietly in the distance, as if listening to every word. Then Lucas continued, voice thick with emotion. We were wrong to think we had the right to control nature, to believe we could survive without it. Fang and his pack have taught us a lesson more powerful than any punishment or law, a lesson in loyalty, in selfless sacrifice, in living in harmony with nature not as a choice, but as a responsibility. The crowd fell silent. Eyes welled up with emotion. In that moment, every heart felt the weight and the honor of the shared duty to protect what had once been so carelessly taken for granted. Some wiped tears from their cheeks, recalling the image of Fang charging through flames to save Lucas, remembering the quiet vigilance of the wolves that had always stood guard over their town, unseen. From that day on, Hollow Creek came alive with the energy of renewal. People eagerly planted trees, tended to injured animals, and helped rebuild the natural habitat. The roar of chainsaws was gone. In its place were gentle, hard-working hands, cradling saplings and nurturing new life. The town, as if waking from a long slumber, had finally understood. They were now the forest's last line of defense. Fang and his pack never strayed far from the reforestation efforts. Though they stayed in the background, they watched, guarded, and protected. Fang was no longer just the alpha wolf. He had become a living symbol of courage and sacrifice for the greater good. Gradually, the first green shoots began to emerge, covering the burn-scarred land like a healing balm. Days of labor under spring's bright sun, or its cold, drizzling rain did not dampen the town's resolve. On the contrary, they worked harder, because with every tree planted, they whispered their deepest apology to the forest they once let down. From that moment on, Lucas and Caleb were no longer just two boys fighting to protect the forest. They became beacons of inspiration for the entire community. They taught the people of Hollow Creek that protecting nature was, in essence, protecting their own future and survival. Most importantly, they helped everyone understand that harmony between humans and animals wasn't some distant ideal. It lived within every heart, waiting only for someone to open it. The Whispering Pines forest was reborn day by day. The wounds it carried began to heal, slowly, through the care, attention, and love offered by both people and animals. And amidst the rising green, Fang stood tall, his eyes glowing with trust. A living symbol that love, loyalty, and harmony were the most precious things in life. After all the turmoil, Whispering Pines had finally returned to life in a vibrant coat of fresh green, stretching endlessly before their eyes like a promise of hope from nature itself. Each evening, as golden light spilled across the horizon and painted soft lines across the canopy, Lucas would sit with his grandfather Samuel on the old wooden porch of their house, quietly watching the peaceful landscape they had both fought so hard to protect. On those evenings, time seemed to slow down, giving space for unspoken thoughts to find their way to the surface. One particular evening, as the final rays of sunlight hung low in the sky, Lucas noticed his grandfather was more contemplative than usual. His eyes, no longer stern, held a distant sadness, as though chasing memories from a faraway past. After a long silence, Samuel finally spoke, breaking the hush between them. "Lucas," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I think it's time I let go of that old story." His hands trembled slightly, his eyes reflecting a grief that had never truly faded through the years. "Since that day," Samuel continued, his voice unsteady, "I've blamed myself for not saving George. That guilt, that fear, it turned into something dark inside me. I started to believe that nature was dangerous, that wild animals couldn't be trusted. I didn't want to lose anyone else, especially not you." He turned to Lucas, his gaze filled with remorse and sincerity. "I was wrong, Lucas. I was too harsh on you because I was afraid. But I failed to see the good in you. I didn't realize how much you'd grown. I held on too tight. And I'm sorry." Lucas was silent for a long while, feeling the depth of pain his grandfather had carried all these years. His eyes were rimmed with tears, but he gently placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder and offered a quiet, understanding smile. "Grandpa," he said softly, "I never blamed you for being strict. In fact, it's your strength that helped me become who I am. Your firmness made me stronger, ready to face everything we've been through. I've always known that beneath your sternness, there was love and worry. I've always known, and I've always understood." Samuel's eyes shimmered with emotion. The depth of his grandson's understanding warmed his heart, thawing a pain that had long frozen there. Then, as if remembering something, he stood up and walked slowly into the house. When he returned, he held a small wooden box, worn and simple. "This," he said quietly, placing the box in Lucas's hands, "is something I've kept with me all the years I've lived alongside this forest." Inside was an old compass, its glass face dulled by time, yet still catching the soft gleam of the setting sun. "This compass once guided George and me through many trials in the woods, and now I'm giving it to you, because I believe you are the one meant to carry on. It won't just help you find your way through the forest. It'll remind you to always keep your heart and your conscience pointing in the right direction." Lucas took the compass with reverence, overcome by a mixture of pride and emotion. It wasn't just a gift, it was a gesture of deep trust. Unable to hold back, he threw his arms around his grandfather, and the two embraced tightly in a silence that said more than words ever could. It was not only an embrace of family, but a binding of generations. A beautiful reconciliation between past and present, sealed with love and understanding. From that moment on, Samuel and Lucas were no longer simply grandfather and grandson. They became true teammates in their shared mission to protect nature. The shadows of the past no longer divided them. Instead, they became a source of strength that pushed them forward. On this new path, they were accompanied not only by the growing saplings in the forest, but also by the spirit of George, by Fang, and the entire wolf pack. Companions who had sacrificed so much to help them understand the true meaning of love and responsibility toward the natural world. Beneath the golden hues of sunset, the young forest whispered its gratitude through the soft rustle of its leaves. And Lucas knew from that day forward, he would never walk alone in his journey to protect this shared home. Because beside him now was the one person he trusted and loved the most, his grandfather, who would stand with him to protect Whispering Pines, where the love between people and nature had become one. As the nightmare of the forest fire faded into memory, the town of Hollow Creek slowly awakened to the value of what they had almost lost. In the hardest of days, Fang and his pack had taught them a profound lesson in coexistence, one that stirred something deeper in the hearts of everyone. That awareness soon inspired a bold new idea: the creation of a protected area solely dedicated to wolves and other wildlife, named the Fang Sanctuary. At first, the idea was met with hesitation from some who still held on to old fears, but powerful images of Fang diving into the inferno to save Lucas, along with the pack's selfless acts, quickly won them over. The plan was eventually approved, and local authorities set aside a vast area of land, including the burned parts of the forest, to become a sanctuary for restoration and the care of injured wildlife. Lucas was one of the first to join the effort. With the support of Caleb, his grandfather Samuel, and dozens of young volunteers, he began working to revive the forest. In those early days, they spent countless hours under the sun, replanting saplings, watering the soil, protecting fragile shoots. Slowly, the scorched land began to wear a new coat of green, wildflowers bloomed, and small animals started returning, drawn by the safety and care they now found there. But the work didn't stop at planting trees. Lucas and his team built a dedicated area for rescuing, rehabilitating, and releasing wild animals back into nature. He never forgot what Fang had done for him, and he poured all his love and dedication into caring for the vulnerable lives in his hands. There were nights when he and Caleb stayed awake in shifts to care for an injured fox or a young deer separated from its mother. These small, quiet acts gradually revived a sense of compassion and kindness across the community, reminding them that nature wasn't something to conquer, but a companion to cherish. Day by day, the hard work began to bear fruit. One warm autumn afternoon, Lucas and his team prepared to release a group of young deer they had raised since birth. As the deer leapt joyfully into the forest's embrace, Lucas suddenly turned around, feeling a familiar presence. At the edge of the sanctuary, he saw a figure he hadn't seen in a long time. It was Fang. The alpha wolf stood silently, his golden eyes calm and focused on Lucas. Lucas froze, his heart pounding at the sight of the wild companion who had once meant everything to him. Fang stood there, majestic yet gentle, as if to make sure Lucas was truly okay. Then, slowly and deliberately, the wolf bowed his head. A simple gesture, yet it carried profound meaning. A silent thank you for everything Lucas and the people of Hollow Creek had done for the forest and for the pack. Lucas smiled softly. He raised his hand and waved toward Fang, a gesture that spoke volumes without needing a single word. In that fleeting moment, a perfect understanding passed between two souls, once bound tightly by hardship and trust. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, and Fang turned away, disappearing slowly into the forest. Lucas knew he might not see the wolves as often as before, but they were always there, watching, protecting, guarding their home. From that point on, humanity and nature would no longer stand in opposition, but side by side, united in a shared purpose: to preserve life in the forest of whispering pines. From that day forward, Lucas continued his work at the sanctuary with unwavering conviction. He often shared the story of Fang with the townspeople, especially the younger generations, hoping to help them understand the deeper meaning of friendship between humans and wild animals. And over time, Fang became more than just a wolf. He became a living symbol of that harmony, a legend passed down with reverence and gratitude. With that, the people of Hollow Creek came to realize that what they were protecting was not just trees or animals, but their own future, the very heart of their community. From the elderly to the children, everyone learned how to live in harmony with nature, cherishing every branch and blade of grass as an essential part of life. Every time Lucas walked into the Fang sanctuary, he could feel it clearly, that somewhere deep in the woods, Fang was still there, along with the pack, silently guarding the forest's peace. He knew that after all they had endured, every hardship and loss, they had finally found the right path, to live in harmony with the natural world. And he also knew that this mission to protect the forest would live on, not only through his own generation, but in all the ones to come. When autumn leaves gently blanketed the winding trails of whispering pines, Fang knew his time was drawing to a close. The old wolf moved slowly through the familiar woods he had spent his life protecting. His steps no longer carried the strength they once did. Each movement now was deliberate, heavy with the weight of years. The once jet-black fur was streaked with silver, and the golden eyes that had once commanded fear and respect were now soft and wistful, filled with memories from a life fully lived. Fang understood he had one final thing to do before he could lay down for the last time in the forest he loved. For days, he wandered alone, sometimes pausing beside a quiet stream to gaze at his reflection in the still water, remembering the days of strength and purpose, of battles fought for territory, of loyal moments shared with the pack. Most of all, he remembered Lucas, the boy who had once saved his life in a snowstorm long ago. Fang could still feel the warmth of those moments, side by side through danger, through fire, through every test. The memories glimmered like distant stars, warming the heart of an old wolf in his final days. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky melted into soft amber, Fang set out on one last journey, to find Lucas again. He didn't know why the instinct was so strong, only that he had to see the boy one more time. With breath shallow and legs unsteady, he moved toward the small house at the edge of the sanctuary, where Lucas now spent his days tending to trees and nursing wounded animals. The scent of humans no longer filled Fang with caution. Instead, it wrapped around him like something familiar and comforting. Lucas sat on the porch, eyes gazing quietly at the young trees swaying in the breeze, when a feeling came over him, an unexplainable sense that something dear was drawing near. He looked up and froze. From the edge of the woods, Fang emerged, moving slowly, deliberately toward him. Lucas's heart skipped, then pounded fiercely as he stood up in disbelief. His eyes welled with tears at the sight of his old friend. Older now, thinner, his body marked by time and struggle. Fang stepped closer, feeling the waves of emotion coming from the boy, now a young man who had once held his fate in his hands. Without hesitation, the old wolf lowered his head and gently rested it against Lucas's leg, a gesture so simple, yet so profound. It was not just a farewell, but a quiet, heartfelt thank you. Lucas trembled, tears streaming freely as he knelt down and wrapped his arms around Fang's head, pressing it gently to his chest. In that silent, tender moment, the two of them felt the strength of a bond that needed no words, a friendship beyond species, a connection that nothing could break. Lucas whispered words of gratitude to Fang, words he had always carried in his heart, but never found the moment to say. Fang listened in silence, his breath weak but his heart still steady, still unwavering as it had always been. He understood every word Lucas spoke, understood that this friendship would live forever in the boy's heart. Fang slowly lifted his head and looked into Lucas's eyes one last time. That gaze shone with gentleness and peace. Then the old wolf quietly withdrew from Lucas's embrace, step by step, disappearing into the deep shadows of the forest he so dearly loved. Lucas stood frozen, eyes locked on the fading figure of his friend, his chest tight with emotion. He knew, with aching certainty, that this was likely the last time he would ever see Fang. But at that same moment, Lucas understood something deeply important. Fang hadn't truly left him. The memories, the lessons, the quiet courage Fang had shown, they would live on, etched into every branch and leaf, into the heart of every small creature in that forest. Lucas raised his eyes to the night sky, now twinkling with stars, and smiled gently through his tears. From that moment on, the image of Fang, the loyal, brave, and intelligent old wolf, was no longer just a wild animal, but a living symbol of friendship, loyalty, and the profound harmony between humans and nature. And to Lucas, Fang wasn't merely a beloved friend. He had become a part of him, a quiet, eternal reminder that no matter how hard the journey, true friendship and unwavering loyalty remain among the most precious gifts in life. Years passed, and the Fang Sanctuary grew into something much greater than a refuge for wolves and wild animals. It became the living heart of Hollow Creek, a source of pride and peace for an entire community. Under the care and love of its people, the Whispering Pines forest slowly healed from the deep scars of its past. Vibrant undergrowth returned. Wildflowers bloomed in bursts of color. Herds of deer wandered freely beside crystal-clear streams. It was a living testament to the power of care, resilience, and forgiveness. Amid all this transformation stood Lucas, now a grown man whose heart still beat in rhythm with the forest. He wasn't just a caretaker of the sanctuary. He had become an educator, a storyteller, and a passionate guide for the youth of Hollow Creek and beyond. His lessons always came back to a single, resonant truth. The balance between humankind and nature is not optional. It is the very foundation of a sustainable and meaningful future. Every week, Lucas led guided walks deep into the sanctuary. There, under the towering pines, he would share the story of Fang, the noble wolf who had spent his life protecting both the forest and the people who once feared him. Lucas's calm, heartfelt voice echoed through the trees, drawing his listeners into a story of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. And no matter how many times the tale was told, it never lost its magic. It always stirred empathy, wonder, and a sense of quiet responsibility in those who heard it. The children of the town looked forward to these visits with eager eyes and open hearts. At the nature center, they would listen intently as Lucas described how the wolves had once stood between the forest and destruction, how people had hurt nature, but also how they learned from their mistakes. Fang, always at the heart of the story, became a symbol to them of loyalty, of protection, and of the possibility of peace between all living beings. Lucas planted these values in them like seeds, knowing they would one day become the guardians of the future. But it wasn't just the children who were moved. Even the adults, some of whom had once opposed the sanctuary, began to see things differently. They watched the forest come back to life, with their own eyes. People who had once cut down trees for profit now volunteered to plant new ones, carefully tending to saplings and injured wildlife with quiet dedication. And in doing so, they finally understood what Fang and his pack had given to this town. Something far greater than any material wealth they had once chased. Something sacred. Lucas understood well that his mission wasn't just to protect the forest and its wildlife, but to reshape how people perceived the world around them. Every lecture he gave, every guided walk through the sanctuary, was a reminder that nature is not something to be exploited without thought. It is a companion, a friend we must respect and protect. And it was the story of Fang, his sacrifice, his unwavering loyalty, that allowed Lucas to deliver that message in the most powerful and heartfelt way possible. As time passed, the traces of Fang remained etched deep into every leaf, every stone, every stream that flowed through whispering pines. Lucas often wandered the forest alone in the quiet of late afternoons, feeling as though Fang still walked beside him, watching over each step with eyes that were once fierce, now remembered with deep affection. That presence gave Lucas strength, fueling his resolve to fulfill the mission his old friend had left behind, to guard this land, to teach people how to live in harmony with it, and to carry forward the enduring lessons of loyalty and unconditional friendship. Hollow Creek had become a place known far and wide, not for glitz or grandeur, but for a story that had touched hearts. Visitors from all corners came not just to admire the untouched beauty of the forest, but to listen, to learn, and to experience something deeper, the profound value of nature itself. They left changed, carrying with them a renewed sense of gratitude and a personal commitment to care for the one world we all share. When night fell and the stars shimmered across the vast sky, Lucas would often stand still beneath their light, gazing upward and whispering a quiet thank you to Fang, because he knew, deep down, that everything good that had come to this town, to this forest, had begun with the loyalty and eternal friendship of a remarkable wolf named Fang. And that thank you was not his alone. It was the forest's, it was Hollow Creek's, it was the soul of a community forever changed by the love of one wild heart, now a timeless symbol of nature's grace and the enduring bond between human and beast. The story of Lucas and Fang was never just about a boy protecting a forest. It was a testament to the bond that can exist between humans and the natural world. From fear and prejudice, the town of Hollow Creek learned that wolves were never the enemy, but quiet guardians of the land they all shared. Because of Lucas's courage and Fang's loyalty, a sanctuary was born, a place where wild creatures could live freely, as they were meant to, in harmony with nature. If you were in Lucas's place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if this story moved you. There are many more heartfelt stories still to come.